going. All right, we have started. Hello, whoever's watching. This is Robert Ryan, and I'm with Max Borders, and we're going to be doing a little fun talk today. We've kind of been riffing a little bit on the topic of explaining the future to Main Street, and we both have noticed that there are certain challenges and priorities that we need to set in terms of getting the ordinary person more involved in owning the future, creating the future, actively engaging with futurism. So it's not just like this elite cult done by elitists in some far off place, you know. So hello, Max.
Hello. And I want to add to that, if you'll permit me, that we always recognize with humility that we could be wrong.
Absolutely.
And yet the trend lines are pretty profound, pretty strong, and we geek out on observing those trends and what's possible. And so, despite the fact that we might be wrong, we still believe that people can and should be actively engaged in shaping the future.
Right. We shouldn't leave it up to experts at Goldman Sachs or at the World Economic Forum and just say, a few hundred smart people in a far off place behind closed doors are going to work this all out for us and explain the future to us later. You know, that's exactly the kind of vibe that we're trying to, or that we think we're going to have a big pushback in society where, one of the classic pushbacks was, the class struggle Marxism, which is, the inequality between the rich and the poor. But there are other kinds of gaps in social class and society. And one of those biggest gaps is participating in the creation of the future
Yeah.
directly.
For sure. And, I actually think that the model that humanity embraces is going to be a lot less about elites behind closed doors and hierarchical arrangements telling us what the future is going to be. In fact, the very model that constructs that image is going to dissipate to some degree with people participating in peer networks, even amateur peer networks. What do you think about that?
Yeah. If we look at some of the early signals and signs, we've got, uh, not just social media in the general sense. We're starting to see really interesting social movements happen that have never happened before. So 2021, everybody's going to remember it as the year that GameStop uh, was manipulated and then counter manipulated. If Do you remember that example? Do you want to mention it or?
Yeah, I think it's a great example because I think it can be applied to a lot of other interesting areas like cryptocurrencies. But the idea is we have this idea of an investor and what an investor is supposed to do. An investor is supposed to make a certain kind of educated guess or bet on the value or the function of something in the marketplace, right? And if you think someone's wrong, you're going to bet opposite to them, right?
Right.
And so we have these people whose function is to bet in one way or the other, and it comes to this kind of blur that is, a market price for some asset, for example, like a stock.
Yeah.
Well, in the case of the game stock, you had what you might think of as a change in what people were betting on. They were betting on ideology, and they were betting on distorting the market for the purposes of changing not only the perception of that asset, but also challenging the thinking that really restrained investor thinking. And
Yeah,
so we have
the received role of the investor,
the received role
of
of
the
the
little
exactly.
investor, especially because so basically, a lot of people know that the global banking industry is very incestuous and that a few dozen firms basically interlock and control a large percentage of the financial market.
Hmm.
But one way that people don't, so the immediate reaction is, okay, we have greedy elitists controlling things and keeping the money from the rest of us. That would be the one simple response to that. Another response to it is to think about it in terms of these people are deciding the future for us, and we are kind of shut out as the ordinary investor into this other role where
Yeah.
they're making long-term decisions, like The Big Short and in Goldman Sachs, where they're thinking long-term, moving the market, manipulating the future in many ways, and we're just stuck dealing with making bets.
Yeah. Right.
Right. But what GameStop showed us was that uh, there are actually ways that decentralized, mm, less powerful actors can reshape the future and even challenge the industry entirely. I mean,
Yeah.
Robinhood was a business model that was sold as, you're gonna, you know, Robin Hood, rob from the rich and give to the poor, and all the little guys are going to cheer and everything. Until people figured out that the business model by which Robin Hood operated at a financial lag, and that's what was paying for the free service, was that
Wow.
the decision makers got to know where the market was going before the common person.
So
And then,
it
yeah.
was sort of like institutionalized insider trading.
Correct. Yeah, it was a legal form of institutionalized insider trading, where the companies who were financially backing Robinhood basically paid the fees for the consumer. I mean, for the
Mm.
ordinary investor, for the right to take the first cut on any trade, to
Yeah.
make the first move, up to 15 minutes in advance of the rest of the market. So you give them their information about the buys and the sells that you want to make, and they get to act on that before you can. And so they always win. And
Yeah.
so some of the Robinhood investors found out about this, and they were like, you know what? Let's see if we can invert this. What we're going to do is we're going to basically pick some, you know, place to stand our ground, and we're going to organize, and we're going to actually shape the future of a stock in a company by killing the companies that are shorting it. And the companies who are shorting it are essentially operating on an insider trading model, where they know they're going to win because they're going to push the market down and everyone's going to react, you know. And they just said, nah, we're going to do the opposite, and we're going to do the irrational thing and
Yeah.
actually buy. Well, ever since they've done that, there's been multiple events on day trading apps where Reddit groups have got together and said, look, they're shorting a valuable company, go get it. And they would just like rush the short. And every time they do that, the businesses that they rush lose like hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. And in fact, they've crashed several major hedge funds who needed to be bailed out. So 2021 has some interesting things going on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think about this in another way. So
Mm-hmm.
I have some sympathy for the traditional investor mindset. I don't have any sympathy for setting up a structure where you're branding people as the little people, as being brought on as investors,
Mm-hmm.
small investors, and then creating some lag time that allows the big boys to
To
exploit
always
them.
win.
Yeah. However, I do like the idea of more distributed and easy investing opportunities for people,
Absolutely.
particularly if they're small scale and low cost.
Right.
Um,
One of
and
the leaders is Fidelity Investments in that.
yeah, but I think about cryptocurrencies, and a lot
Mm-hmm.
of Main Street folks are still catching up to what is this stuff? What is this Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these
Yeah.
other things? And you have
Every day I have people ask me questions about it when when I go out and I'm like at a bar or a restaurant, and it comes up. People are like, we're 11 years into this, 12 years into this. We still don't know what it is.
Well, and it's tough because
Yeah,
this is a space, if you want to call it a space, a market space that was created by a cognitive elite
it was.
in finance and in computer science. And
Right.
these people are no dummies.
No.
So we must acknowledge that. But it wasn't set up by the cognitive elite, at least not all cryptocurrencies. Most of the ones that are now dead were certainly set up by people who were, finding ways to create scams and pyramid schemes and things like that. And there was a lot of
Mm,
that
mm,
in the lead up to 2017, and it caused people to get savvy when it crashed. But backing up from that a second, just
mm-hmm,
trying to explain to someone that you could use in the future, which is now for a lot of people, but in the
mm-hmm,
future that they could use something sort of like their Apple stock to buy a cup of coffee
Right.
is a very strange idea. And that's just the
Right.
cryptocurrency part.
Liquid equity is really the future to me in that. And the
Yeah.
idea of a liquid equity is to say you don't need a separate thing called a currency and a stock, or basically any sort of form of property could be traded.
Right.
Right.
And the properties of all of this technology create the value of their networks.
Right.
So people who don't understand the cryptocurrency and distributed ledger space will often say things like, well, these tokens have no real value. They're not pegged to anything real
Right.
in the world.
Right.
Well, relational properties, when I contract you for a service, like I
Mm-hmm.
want to get you to teach me something about business and economics, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a service that you're providing for me. We understand that.
Right.
We understand that machines and computers can provide services to us. For example, I can hold something in escrow without the need for a third party, and I can do that with someone on the other side of the world, so I don't need to have to trust them.
Right.
Well, that's something that cryptocurrency tokens, their underlying technology, can do. And so when I participate in buying a piece of the technology commons that's underlies this the substrate, I'm basically saying, hey, there's something, this really valuable system out there. And when I buy the token in this, I'm actually investing in the long term, what I think of as the medium to long term properties of this starting to scale out and be of real value to people. The more
Mm.
people use these valuable utilities, the more value these networks are going to have. That's a
Right.
really hard thing to persuade people of.
Right.
But when you say it in something like, well, one thing you might be able to do is buy a cup of coffee with a stock, or you say you're investing in people's ability to do legal contracts without lawyers,
Right.
then maybe you start to get somewhere. And
Right.
I think
So it's
those kind of
about
concrete conversations are really interesting.
right. So it's really about trying to move the conversation from this abstract technical or philosophical level into something more concrete.
Yeah.
The ordinary people want metaphors or examples to things that they already understand, because they say, explain that to me in comparison with something I already know clearly. And that's the most common ways that an educator explains anything new, is to say, well, you know, it's like this, only different, you know.
Well, and here's
Yeah.
where the GameStop stuff comes into
Right.
cryptocurrencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because let's say I get together with a bunch of people on Reddit, just as you described earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and I say, I really desperately want one of these cryptocurrencies to unseat the dollar.
Right.
Because the dollar, I don't like the dollar. It's too politicized. It
Right.
causes inflation. It causes all of these problems.
Right.
Let's just say I believe that. And in
Right.
fact, I do, but that's neither here nor there. And so I say, I'm going to invest in Cardano because
Right.
I believe that Cardano has these specific properties that make it better than the dollar,
Right.
but not yet, because right now it's it's not being used for the kind of valuable things that I think it should and
Right.
can, but it will in the next 10 years. And I want to be the first there. So that's one part of it. That's good
Right.
investor hat.
Right.
The second part of it is I'm an ideologue in the sense that I don't want the dollar anymore and I want something to unseat it. And I'm willing to put money on the dollar being unseated as if I were an activist with my
Right.
dollars.
Right. And so,
Or,
and we call that investor activism, but the thing is,
yeah,
like, in the old school of investor activism, it was thought that what you'd have to do is buy a controlling share of stock. You'd have to go through proxy voting. You'd have to know how to deal with boards of directors. You'd have to come up with all these very, insider kinds of knowledge to try to move the direction of a company.
yeah,
And a classic example was the company Sunbeam. Went from one of the best managed to worst managed companies when it had a management change, and the investor activists saw that and said, we got to get those people out of there. And
yeah,
so they basically mm, started a campaign just to depose that management. And of course, the shares also go up in value because the theory, not only is it a goal that's good for people, but it also should be profitable in that regards. Now we're talking about another kind of investor activism where you're basically saying, I don't have to go through that process. There are other ways that I can let the world know what my priorities are. Um,
Yes.
and
And
so
I'm
for,
it's
yeah,
and it's as simple with cryptocurrency tokens as voting with your feet.
that's right. It's a kind
I'm
of
going to
voting.
I'm going to say that I prefer this system to this
Mm,
other system.
right.
It's as simple as that.
Right. Kind of like voting for American Idol. When
Yeah.
where there's no perfectly fair or accurate way to pick which idol wins. And oh my, like everybody says you really don't have to get first place in American Idol. You just have to be in the top few. If you're close enough to the winner's circle, chances are your career is going to take off. And the same thing is true with a lot of these sort of future technologies. We know they work. The geeks, the one thing that the geeks are good for, the early creators of these ideas and technologies, is that they know the proof of concept.
Yeah.
They know that it works. So for example, the combustion engine, you know, when Daimler and Maybach invented a combustion engine for the automobile that really worked, it was like um 1882, and they had a proof of concept. The thing ran.
Mm.
And there were some people who looked at that and they said, I still don't believe you because I haven't seen it sitting in a car and I haven't seen the wheel and I haven't seen the whatever. But Daimler and Maybach said this was the hard part. This was the thing that really needed to be proved. And here's the basic value propositions of this engine. This engine gets us this much faster with this little less weight and whatever. And that's the important point. The easy stuff is like throwing tires on it. Okay.
It has the
That's
power of 3 horses, which we call now horsepower.
exactly. But so the easy part is basically is all that other finishing of the automobile, because you just take a carriage and make it, horseless carriage. But so the inventors basically already know what the important proofs of concept are. Same thing's true with crypto. Same thing's true with, new forms of organization and technology. There's been trial runs. There's been prototypes, and
Yeah.
so Main Street takes is it basically says, well, I don't believe you until I see it with my own eyes that the whole thing's working, and
Yeah.
then you'll convince me. What
Well,
would
and there's
Yeah.
also
Right.
with that the fear of the unfamiliar,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there was back in 1970 something, they had this crazy science that came out called
Mm-hmm.
in vitro fertilization, where
Mm-hmm.
you could literally take the egg out of a woman's body, inseminate it, and cause it to be reimplanted in the woman, in the female, the
Right.
female partner. And this was akin at the time to playing God. It was reviled by the religious community and
Mm,
bioethicists. Everyone was almost, and including the elites, were horrified by this.
right.
And yet today there is very little, if any, such horror on IVF.
Only
Um,
among the most extreme. I mean, you have to go ultra conservative. Now, ultra conservatives
yes.
still exist, but it's such a small. They don't move the political vote.
No, not, and really, they're not even on most people's radar anymore with IVF. You're like, oh, I
Right.
hope you guys succeed in having a baby,
Right.
because it's just so commonplace and it's so tested. So,
It's been normalized, as you would
well, how
say.
do you how do
Right.
you see is the proof of concept? How do you bridge the gap between the proof of concept on the one hand
Right.
and the fear of the unknown or the unfamiliar on the other?
Exactly. Now, one of those thoughts is that basically, a point that you've brought up recently, which is the idea of things are taboo that haven't been done yet. And so you'd say, well, it, the way I was raised was good enough for me. This is weird. Why do I have to learn a new way of looking at life? I mean, I'm like 30, 40, 50. I've already kind of made things work. Now you're asking me to turn in my car keys and have automated vehicles everywhere. Like, you're telling me that I practiced becoming a good driver for 1,000 hours for nothing? Like, there's a lot of sunk cost attitudes about the past, right?
That's true.
Where you've said, like, I sunk all this effort into the past, and you're like, okay, well, we're moving on now. And people are like, more
But then
stuff
your
I got to do, more stuff I got to do.
neighbor comes over and says, "Man, I can't tell you how awesome it was to be able to drink a cup of coffee and read my paper
Mm-hmm.
while sitting in the back of this or wherever they sit
Yeah.
in this automated vehicle."
Yeah. Try it. You might like
And
it.
then
It's
all of
what,
a sudden,
yeah.
your sister comes up and says this, or
Right.
who or whoever, and after a while, you're like, well, maybe it isn't so bad. They didn't die,
Right.
There, it's how
Yeah.
there's a lot of network effects in terms of these, well, how people adopt technology through the classic, first mover and subsequent movers,
Right. So,
or adopters rather.
movers and so movers are usually the businesses, whereas the adopters are usually
Right.
the consumers. But yeah, so you start from like that early adopter phase and you go down, and this is one of the most popular models in business. And so a lot of people who aren't trained in that, they don't know it's like almost a law of nature, or that basically there's this curve of adoption.
Yeah.
And that at the beginning, you have these visionaries who basically deeply understand the value of things way ahead of them actually happening. It's like there, for example, there was a car inventor in the United States, Oliver Evans, who was in Philadelphia, and he invented check it out. He skipped the whole idea of a car and went straight to an amphibious land water vehicle powered by uh, uh, um, steam pumps, that was an all-purpose terrain vehicle for construction that was specifically invented to dredge and build dredge rivers and lakes and to build bridges. All right, so they didn't start with like, oh, here's a wagon and I'm just going to throw an engine on it. He actually started with a special purpose technology that was way fancier, and that was 1803, first automobile. All right, at least that was patented in the United States as an automobile. And the thing is, the costs weren't very good. It was a budget overrun, but the city of Philadelphia funded it anyway, and they used it a little bit. It just wasn't, so they had a proof of concept. It just wasn't a true cost proposition that would save you money over using labor. But then, 70 years later, automobile. So that means that people who understood the amphibious vehicle that Oliver Evans created in 1803 knew it was an inevitability that we're going to have buses, and then we're going to have trains, we're going to have all these other things, because they saw the most sophisticated proof of concept first,
Yeah.
you know.
And that propagation effect that we were talking about, where people, it's really as simple as somebody who is pretty fearless and a geek
Mm-hmm.
adopts it, and then they start talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's adoption and sweet talk.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like it's in your bones or in your genes. For a lot of people, there is
Mm-hmm.
a natural sort of suspicion of novelty.
That's right.
But there are certain personality types, and I wonder if this is genetic, even like for
Mm-hmm.
human populations. It's like Mother Nature knew that we need people who were explorers, who tried things
Right.
out, and those who were like, whoa, let's slow down a minute before we change all this up, because this is working, right?
Right.
And you get this more, for better lack of a better set of terms, progressive and conservative groups. And I don't mean that politically,
Right,
although
it's
there's some overlap
technically
there.
right. So it's technically and culturally. So
Yeah.
basically, early adopters are those people who are always eager to see the future, and they want to play a part in bringing it about. Thing is, that's usually only 2 to 6% of the population for most technologies and cultural changes. And then what happens? I'll give you an example. Black Panther. That was a great movie, right? That was a different kind of script for superhero movies, a different
Hmm.
kind of script for Hollywood in terms of, the main plot points, the main order, things like that. And the art was fantastic, whatever. However, whenever you have something that is a blockbuster
Mm-hmm.
that comes out to the whole audience, it's because they already knew that that audience would like that stuff.
Yeah.
It was not a stab in the dark. That means there were years of market research and product testing and interviews and conversations and early independent films that used some of those concepts, right? And so basically what they did is just these were experts who said, we think the world has caught up to this. Let's put this out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes, that that it's still, for movies and culture, it's still it's enlightened guesswork, because there's so many
Yeah.
movies that flop,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
and
The
they try
flop
to
rate
use
is
this
pretty high,
programmatic.
about 70%, 70% flop.
Yeah, but that's not to say that they haven't recognized patterns
Right.
of success.
Yeah.
And this is why you see a lot of these franchises are so similar to one another.
Right.
They use the same tropes, they use the same devices, and I think that that is generally going to persist in time. What else are you going to do?
Right.
But what's
It's
interesting,
cognitively simple. That way, everybody has a simple frame of reference, and you only have to make a small leap to the next product.
yes,
It's not
yes,
stressful.
you have to have enough novelty for them
Right.
to go, "Ooh, this is different." Because who wants to watch the same Avengers movie over and over again? Nobody.
Right. Right. But not at so much novelty that they're confused or don't understand the format.
Yeah,
So
right on.
we used to say there's like a U-shaped curve with novelty, and you're always looking for that sweet spot in the middle, because out here is like cuckoo land, and over here is boring, right?
So this is but there's always, but everything interesting and good in the future starts off in cuckoo land
Yeah,
to some degree,
always. And that's
right?
why the main street is always lagging, is because of course it's a little cuckoo. It's never happened before. And the people who get there first always have their own weird ideas about how it's going to be used. So
So let me
yeah,
ask you this then. How do you, when something, let's say you
mm,
want you, like me, are into cryptocurrencies
right,
and cryptocurrency tokens,
right,
and you want to get people to do it.
right.
Do you pay lip service and sweet talk, or do you get them to try it out? Do you give them some? Is it learning by doing and getting familiar with it, or is it, hey, try this? Is it, or is it more like talking about it, or is it a little mix of both? Like, what's the most effective way to hasten the coming of the future, if you think it is that beneficial because you happen to be a geek with that far sight?
Right. So here's my opinion about it, is that there's two primary ways to do it. The first one is goes back to the old Apple days. We call it the killer app.
Yeah.
And for those people who don't remember, which is most people, when Apple first came out, they needed some reason for people to buy the damn thing. Instead of just saying, it's a computer, what don't you get about it? People were like, I've never owned a computer. Nobody I know has ever owned a computer. Computers are only at offices behind their big machines, and they take cards and that kind of stuff. What the heck am I going to do with this thing? And so, and the early geeks are like, well, you're going to write software on it and you're going to do it. And the people are like, well, that sounds horrible. Like, that does not sound like my idea of fun. You got to give me something better than that. And so then they were like, well, we got this word processor thing. And they're like, well, okay, I already have an electric typewriter. Can you do better than that? And and then finally they came up with VisiCalc, which is basically what Excel is now, which is
Yeah.
spreadsheet software. And that was the killer app, because originally when it came out, there was no spreadsheet software on the mainframe computers that already existed. And they were able to show that the visual system that was being used for like Windows and for early computers was superior to the non-visual system of like punch cards and codes and whatever, specifically for that spreadsheet software. And so people were buying apples and calling them VisiCalc machines for years. Like it was an actual thing where people would walk into a store and be like, I want to get a VisiCalc machine. And they're like, oh, you mean the Apple II? You know, that was a real thing. And so when you get people asking for a technology because of a killer use of it, that just like proves that this is something different from what came before and it works better, then you're going to see a stampede towards that killer app.
Well, and then fast forward, you get this little thing that
Mm-hmm.
plays music on it,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got these earphones. It's called you call it a what? An iPod?
Right.
Oh man, this is cool. I can walk around and I no longer have to have cassettes and I no longer have to have CDs and CD players. I can put all my music on this little tiny thing. Wait a
Yeah.
minute. Next generation, I'm calling my mom on this. Wait a minute. I'm also using VisiCalc on it, and I'm and suddenly the smartphone revolution is just the convergence of all these technologies
Right.
operating in according to Moore's law, where things get smaller and smaller, processing speed gets faster and faster, and it's
Right. And so you know that if there's a technology that can have multiple killer apps, it could be continued to aggregate the in other words, you've got 101 tools in your tool shed. If you can get that down to 10 tools, 5 tools, 3 tools by aggregating them into a more complex tool, that's money right there. And and of course,
it's
ease of
yeah.
use. Anything that makes your life easier is a big deal.
So there's this guy I'm sure you're very familiar with, given your background and your education. But
Mhm.
there's this Harvard guy who's really good. He's recently passed. His name was Clayton Christensen,
Yes.
and he coined the term disruptive innovation or disruptive technology.
Mhm.
And what he meant by that is not always what people use when they say disrupt.
They simplified it.
They simplified it. But what Clayton Christensen meant was you had on about 1995 through 2000, maybe even on up to about 2005, you had all of these kind of different phones that had
Mhm.
massive capabilities.
Mhm.
So many capabilities that people couldn't really figure them out, and interfacing them with them was a barrier.
Right.
And so Nokia, the Finnish company, came out with this wonderful little phone with very simple things. You could
Mhm.
call people and you could text them and maybe you could play a little game. And that was
Mhm.
it. And they were cheap and they were wonderful and people bought them like hotcakes.
They used to call it the grandma phone, basically, because it was the product that got the latest adopters to finally jump in.
Yeah.
Because they said, what does the late adopter want? And sometimes, so it's a sequence. So like the early adopters want something, that is very abstract or very ideological or is going to help their career,
Yeah.
like
Super, a lot of functionality.
entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
Whereas by the time you get to the opposite end, you have people who uh the elderly who basically don't want to learn anything new, not because they're jerks, but because it really is stressful for an elderly person to have to learn new things. Um, or you have people who are very conservative. You have people who don't trust the technology system, and there's a lot of people who just hold out because of that lack of trust of the system. Who would
Yeah.
say, "Look, it's not that I hate computers so much as that I just don't trust the Apple network. It's more than just the computer; it's the whole system of
Yeah.
relationships." And what happens is people eventually have to get into that. So here's my second point, because you asked me. The first one was the killer app. The second one, what you and I talked about before we got on the call, would be simulation and gamification, which
Mm.
basically means if people are allowed to play through something, even if it's as long as it's very similar to the real thing, uh, then they'll be able to say, "Well, I can see how that would work out in real life." And so you can either do it in virtual simulations, augmented reality, virtual reality. You can create. I don't like using this term very much, but a safe or a place to experiment, so that people can trial things before uh, they have to fully commit. Um, and like you said, you get to you. Everyone wants to look at what everybody else is doing and saying, "How are they doing it? Am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? Am I doing it better or worse? Are there ways of doing this I wouldn't have thought of myself?" But my, you know, you and so if you put people in a simulated environment, maybe even give them some privacy, you might be able to accelerate their relationship to that technology and get Main Street involved much earlier than they would without being able to visualize it.
Well, and this is where I think, and we can start to wrap up on this note because I know
Hmm.
we gotta put a period at the end of this paragraph. But
Right.
um, when the iPhone hit the scene, and very shortly thereafter the Droid phone,
Mm.
the model that this brought to the world was neither disruption in the Clayton Christensen sense,
Right.
nor disruption in the sense that it's used bandied about right now. It was such an interesting blurring because what you got was this modularization,
Yeah.
a very, very simple interface that gives you any tool that you like,
Hmm.
where the tool set is distributed. In other words, the app developers were not really situated in Apple. They were
Hmm.
situated around the world, and they were developing apps for this particular modularized
Hmm.
entity. And
Hmm.
so on so all of a sudden, and you get a mixture of with of the old disruption and the new disruption
Right.
in one product.
Right.
And that was really interesting. Now we take that for granted, and everybody, including grandma, can use an iPhone.
Right.
And just it's same something similar, I think, can be said about Netflix.
Right.
Netflix took this arduous and kind of complicated process for consuming media. And remember, they
Mhm.
started off by mailing people DVDs,
Right.
which was just an interesting model in and of itself. But after that, they started this a la carte service that was completely on the web and then on your phone, and it was game over. This consolidation that Netflix and a la carte services now represent is, again, this really super simple interface that gives you a lot of different options to go into.
Yeah, and again, we have ease of use and multifunctionality as
Yeah.
becoming the dominant traits. And so, I guess, what we identified a long time ago is that when you get past the early adopter phase and you get more towards the center of the market, those two traits dominate, which is I want more features for the same buck, and I want it to be easier. And if you can keep making it easier and keep providing me more features, I'll keep paying the same price, which is why, like in computers, the prices don't change, because
Mm.
what happened is that the consumer said, basically, there's a stabilization where the consumer is like, okay, that's a fair price point for a computer. We could do it more cheaper or more expensive, but we usually kind of end up gravitating back to the same price points over and over again for all complex goods, automobiles, computers, things of that nature. Um, and then what happens is that every year the inventors just have to figure out how much value I can give you for that money. And it just becomes generational updates. So as long as there's a generation, people get into a groove. Like the iPhone 8 was easy to sell compared to the iPhone 2, you know. And
Yeah, and it really does represent such a there are network effects to be sure too,
right.
but it's really interesting that the massive difference in price differential between Android based or Windows based products,
Mm-hmm.
especially on the hardware side, and Apple based products is
Mm-hmm.
just massive.
Mm-hmm.
And that could change, but it hasn't. And it's maybe next time we can try to unpack why that is. But
Yeah.
I really appreciate you talking to me today about communicating the future with Main Street, because I think part of hastening more of the good things that we want to come online
Mm-hmm.
involves just getting people to understand and disarm them of their fears.
Absolutely. And I kind of think the overall theme here is that, if you really want to impress the earlier adopter, they want a proof of concept and they want some sort of goal or ideological impact that's going to attract them to that, or like I said, a career opportunity. Is this something I can make money on? Is this something I can have a career in? You know, whereas again, as you get more towards the middle of the market and the later adopter pool, the real question is, how do we get them to try this and find it to be fun, easy, and multifunctional without them being stressed? In other words, it's got to be something playful, it's got to be something volunteer. And so, long story short, taking it back to the crypto thing, I think that uh, one of the biggest impacts for crypto is going to be the creation of portable digital objects throughout game universes. So
Absolutely.
so you have this.
In-game
Right. So you have this like blockchain technology. If you're going to have a crypto currency, you have a fixed block with a fixed unit and fixed trading patterns. Okay. But if you want a crypto property rights regime, you want it to be able to manage any object that fits within that block size. So, for example, Bitcoin SV uses a 2 GB block size. And what that means is any object 2 GB or smaller, any digital object whatsoever, could be encoded on that chain. And then, therefore, now you have like what I call a property wallet, not just a token wallet. And that property wallet will allow you to move digital assets from one to another digital space seamlessly. Could even move it into augmented reality, virtual reality, back and forth from one platform to another. And the property rights will allow you to verify and transfer it as if it's a real, consistent object.
and it's well, maybe we'll save it for next time.
It's a good cliffhanger
It
for next
is. It is.
time.
I won't go into this one, even though I'm dying to. But I just want to thank you for inviting me to talk today. This has been a lot of fun.
Good. It's been fun for me too. I really like the way that I think you're a natural educator, especially to the public, being able to talk comfortably about these things. Again, some of the people we have conversations with, they can talk to professors, they can talk to grad students, but you try to get them to talk to the average person, and they're just all thumbs. You know.
No doubt. No doubt. Likewise.
All
Likewise, to be sure.
all right.
They're
Thanks.
natural. We'll
Thanks.
talk again soon.
All right. Have a good day.
Yeah.